Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jay Parsons, professor and director of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Today is part of our weekly webinar series that are typically live every Thursday at noon. You can find a schedule of our upcoming webinars as well as an archive of every recording of past webinars on our center's website, which is cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu. In today's webinar, with tight row crop margins and increased expenses, many producers are asking questions about incorporating annual forage systems into their crop rotations. So we're going to focus today on the economics of that decision while delving into the value of annual forages and what they can provide as a feed resource. And then if we have time, we'll talk about some of the positives that can come from diversification into annual forages in addition to your row crop enterprises. Joining me here today to present is Dr. Mary Drewnoski, an associate professor of animal science, livestock systems extension specialist, and a fellow in our Center for Agricultural Profitability. Welcome, Mary. Yeah, go ahead.
No, just glad to be here.
Yeah. And also joining us is Dr. Daren Redfearn. He's a professor and extension forage and crop residue specialist here in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. Daren, I almost traded you over to our side of the ship. But anyway, here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, he's also a fellow in our Center for Agricultural Profitability. Hello, Daren, and welcome to today's webinar.
Hello, Jay. Thanks for that introduction. There are also worse places to be than the Department of Agricultural Economics. So well, I'm glad to work with you and Mary, and excited about what's going to happen today with this.
Thank you, Daren. Very kind of you to say that. And I'll speak for both of our my co-presenters here, and we welcome interruptions and questions throughout the presentation. The nature of this topic is one where there is no one size fits all. So it's not like we're going to be offering a prescribed solution that you just need to incorporate. So we welcome any questions that you have throughout, and we'll have some time at the end, I'm sure, to entertain some extra questions as they come in. So don't hesitate to pipe up as we go. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start us off with this topic. Oops, sorry, I got to get my slides advancing here. There we go. And I'd like to start with the key points or objectives of our webinar today. And I already mentioned one of them with these tight margins that we're seeing in our traditional commodity crops. They're much smaller than they have been over the last several years, predominantly driven by lower prices, but also we've seen an increase in costs. A few years ago, they went up dramatically. You could argue that they're leveling off now, but they're still much higher than they were, say, 5 years ago. So those tight margins are driving this decision. That's a trigger, is what we might say in decision making, that's generating a lot of the questions. Annual forages is a topic that we're looking at today because it provides an option to basically combat some of those tight margins in the row crops. But there's several ways to make it work for you. So our primary objective today is for you to think through some of those different decisions or questions that you should be asking for your own situation. So here's just I put three short ones up here. How you're going to harvest that revenue from those annual forages. That, of course, makes a difference, whether you're actually mechanically harvesting it or grazing it, etc. What are some of the short-term crop rotation implications? So we're getting questions, obviously, this year with the tight margins this year. How does it affect this year? And then, longer term, moving into next year and the year after, right? Is this something that you want to incorporate strategically longer term into your operation, perhaps expanding your crop rotation to more years and more crop choices and so on? Or is this just a short-term solution for the current situation that you're looking to maybe transition out of in 1 or 2 years? So those are the types of questions you need to be asking yourself, and that'll make a difference in how you actually want to implement it. And there's a lot more questions that obviously will come up as you try to sort out the details and how you might make use of annual forages on your farm. So the primary purpose here is to help you think through those questions and decide for yourself on whether you want to incorporate them into your cropping system or not, and how you want to incorporate those. So this is about decision making, and I've written some materials on how to make smart choices in agriculture. And there's a URL here. We're going to assemble a document to send out to everybody who's registered after the webinar with all of these links that will be popping up here throughout the webinar today. So if you don't get these down, that's fine. There is a QR code there if you have a phone and want to pull it up quickly. But that document just explains the different pieces of what I would call a methodology for making smart choices. The part I want to emphasize today is that we'll talk a lot about asking questions and this communication piece over here on the right-hand side. You need to know what it is that you want to accomplish with this decision. And part of it is profitability, obviously, because that's the trigger doing it. But there's a lot of other things going on your farm. And the important thing is to basically ask the right questions to the right people and sort through that information so that eventually you have some good alternatives to choose from. And then you're able to, assess on how you actually want to implement them if you want to implement them. So that resource is there for you to skim through. It's a very quick read, but it's just to give you some thought processes as you sort through some of these more difficult decisions, like the one that we're talking about here today. So on the topic of tight margins, this is the numbers from ERS, the Economic Research Service of USDA, that they've put out on corn production costs and returns per planted acre. So these are per acre numbers up here. They exclude any government payments attached to that. And when we go to take a look at that bottom line down there, that does not include the land cost or just the general overhead for the farm. And to give you an idea, on our enterprise budgets here at UNL, we usually attach a $25 or $30 per acre general overhead charge to our crop budget. So that's not included in here either, and nor is any cash rent that you might be paying or any return on equity or interest costs attached to land ownership. But these are some of the numbers, the 21, 22, and 23 numbers. That's looking backwards. That's their data as far as the national average goes for gross value per acre for corn production. And of course, we had pretty good prices back in 2022. They kind of leveled off a little bit here in 23. I would argue that some of these numbers that they have up there are still pretty solid for 2024, but we got things dipping down a lot on the revenue side. Predominantly, that's all driven actually by the price, because they assume trend yields here of 181 bushels per acre. These are national average numbers that they pulled from the data, and Nebraska is one of those states where we're kind of at the intersection of three different crop resource districts as far as USDA goes. And of course, on the eastern side of the state, we fall into that heartland district, which captures all of the I states, where like 22% of our crop acres are in the country, and most of our corn and soybean acres are in our country. But the rest of the state, the northern part of it goes into the northern plains. The southern part of it goes into the Prairie Gateway down into Kansas and Oklahoma. So Nebraska is one of those states where we have pretty diverse production across the state, depending on where you're at and what county. So it's one of those things where these averages probably apply to our state averages, pretty darn close, but in your individual situation, quite likely that they're off by a notch one direction or the other. This is on center pivot averages too for the country too, which is, as you know, Nebraska dominates in terms of irrigated crop acres. Okay, but the bottom line is these operating costs. We saw the uptick in operating costs that, kind of went with that uptick in prices that we had in 2022. They've leveled off a little bit in 2023, and then we're looking at those going down perhaps a little bit more in 2024. This is where I think they might be a little bit optimistic on those things. We have seen some things like fertilizer costs and seed costs has been fairly level this year compared to last year. Fertilizer costs maybe gone down a smidge, but they're also projecting labor and stuff like that to go up. So there are some things in there, and herbicide, pesticides, those types of things that might be a little optimistic on the operating cost side. So these are things that you're going to have for inputs in here. Fuel would be included in there, as well as all those seed and fertilizer, et cetera, costs that go on. So decent margins coming out of just the operating piece, but then when you start putting in the other fixed costs attached to labor, and they split theirs up in terms of hired labor and opportunity costs and unpaid labor on the assumption that most people are sole proprietors, so to speak, and doing a family withdrawal, not necessarily drawing a salary, but somewhere in that $35 an acre range to cover the labor costs. And then the capital recovery on machinery and equipment is down here in the bottom line. And this is one where you notice that trend just keeps going on up and up and up. And that reflects the increased cost of equipment. New equipment is becoming increasingly more expensive and has for a number of years. I think that's pretty modest. We actually saw in our crop budgets for 2024 a much bigger jump than what's reflected here in terms of that capital recovery cost. But the bottom line is down there on the bottom, the value of production less the costs that I have listed here. It just continues to squeeze down around $150 for corn per acre, according to their projections for 2024. Keep in mind, that's got to cover your land costs, right? So if you're thinking land, cash, rent, in a lot of cases, you're looking at negative returns on that. So that's generating a lot of the questions. If you own your land, of course, you maybe don't have all the cash outflow for cash rent, but you still have to pay your land taxes, and your opportunity costs or your return on that equity in the land may not be much with that type of margin to work with. So that's the picture for corn that we've seen over the last 3 years and projections for 2024. For soybeans, we see a similar pattern emerging, especially with that drop in 2024 numbers that we have there. Revenue going down almost $100. So we see it down in that 174 range for corn, or for soybeans, 153. For corn, you put that into a 2-year rotation, you look at about $160 net that you could be looking at there to cover that land cost for you on your operation. So obviously that's a much different picture than we saw 2 or 3 years ago. And so we're getting a lot of questions then, do I want to put this crop into the ground or not? Is this a long-term solution? Or do I want to maybe delve into some of the annual forage options that are available?
Yeah, and I'll just chime in and say, while you have that picture going on with the crop side, the cattle side currently looks a little bit different, right? And that's another driver of why people are asking this question, is because right now cattle prices look really good and probably projected to look good into next year as well, based off of some of what I have seen. So you have those two things going on that may make you ask this question, especially if you are a diversified operation already and have both.
Yeah, and last year we had the extra dynamic of a drought situation where forage prices were extremely high, and and there was some incentive just to have forage available for those livestock producers to feed their animals. So a lot of things over the last couple of years that are super interesting, and as everybody out there with experience in ag knows, these things ebb and flow, which is why it's really important to know from your perspective, if you're looking at this strategically as more of a long-term adjustment to your operation, or maybe more short-term, that you're going to transition and then look to transition back out to a traditional corn soybean rotation. So that's a key piece of information to have handy, and something to give some thought to. Thanks, Mary. Sorry, my slides quit advancing here. There we go. Okay, so Daren, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you talk about this slide a little bit.
Okay, so kind of to get started in this process, one of the things that we always like to do is look a little bit at the estimated annual forage establishment cost. I've got 3 examples here: oats, cereal rye, and Sudan grass. All 3 of those are different. The oats differs from the cereal rye in that the oats can be fall planted or can be spring planted, or either spring planted. Cereal rye can be best planted in the fall and then utilized the following spring. And then effectively Sudan grass, if you're in a forage system, can follow either the oats or the cereal rye. Okay, so if you look at the seed cost, there are some differences in seed cost. Oat on a per pound basis is the most expensive seed of the compared to cereal rye. Sudan grass is quite a bit more expensive than either one of those two. So if you just look at the seed cost on that, that's gonna make you make a different decision than if you follow through this process. Planting costs for all three of these are pretty similar. Fertilization costs are similar for the oats and the cereal rye, looking at around 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The fertilization costs for the Sudan grass are a little bit greater because its growing season is longer. It's going to have a little greater requirement for nitrogen. So that cost is not quite as probably, again, I'm going to do bad math here, but it's probably about 25% greater fertilization than either oats or the cereal rye. We like to recommend a split application on that. So the application costs across the board are $10 an acre for nitrogen application costs, but because you're split applying the Sudan grass, that application cost is twice as high. Okay, so if you look at the total cost of these on a per acre basis, they're pretty much going to follow that seed cost. Most expensive forage on a per acre basis is going to be that Sudan grass. Oats is a little bit higher than cereal rye, but effectively those are pretty much the same. Okay. And then Mary and I just talked this morning about an hour about how to value the forage production. Okay. And what we came up with was an estimate of 2 animal unit months for both the oats and the rye, and 3 animal unit months for the Sudan grass, and then calculated that by the average value of the AUMs provided by pasture. Okay, on a lease rate, I believe is that how we did that. Okay, so then when you look at the cost per AUM, which is how we've started valuing everything, you look at the cost per AUM, which is basically that total cost per acre divided by the number of AUMs. Cost across the board is pretty similar, around $40 per AUM. So, even though the cost of the Sudan grass is much greater per acre because it yields greater, that moderates or increases the value a little bit, if you will. That's shown there in the 64 times our estimated AUM. So, that's part of the thought process there. And again, I would hesitate to make the decision based on seed cost alone, even though that's how this one falls out. But the point is, it's going to be more important to look at the cost per AUM and not necessarily the total cost per acre.
Yeah, I'll throw in there a couple things. One of which is, like, you look at these costs per AUM, and as he said, the way we valued it, if you look at that second from the bottom line, was kind of the average AUM cost of pasture. Now, number one, that assumes, like, if you want to make a comparison, that you can find pasture at that AUM, right? Which is not always true. And then the other one is that this does not have land cost in there, right? So if you were to take Jay's 160, right, so on his average, or you look at pasture rental rates, like our assumptions here of 2 AUMs for oats or cereal rye and 3 for Sudan, that's about what we got last year on dry land in eastern Nebraska. So if you look at that and you say, what's the rental rate of pasture or of dry land, kind of marginal cropland, which is what that was on, it ranges from 155 to 210, so somewhere close to that 160. If I add that in, it adds another $30 to $40. So I'm looking at $70 to $80 in AUM in total cost if I was to say I had to rent the land to do it. Now the range on pasture is 40 to 80. So it looks like we're in the realm of possibilities. Of course, depending on your location and your production, these costs may be different. How much can you get from oats? We say 2 AUMs. If you have a really productive year, it's going to be more. If you have a very dry year on some dry land, it's not going to be as much. It might be 75% of that. So we can't give you a absolute, but I do think it starts to get you, okay, how would I calculate this based off of what I might expect? And it still looks in that realm. The other comment was, Daren and I talked about this a bit, and that is, what do you compare it to? That $64 was an average pasture. And the question was, will they have high quality and low quality pasture, and the costs? And these forages, if managed well, are high quality. We can usually get 2 pound a day on stalkers fairly easily on oats, cereal rye, or even Sudan grass. So that's another question you have to ask yourself, is what's the potential productivity you get off of it? An AUM, if it's just cows, what's the nursing calf going to gain? And then if it's stalkers, what's that stalker going to gain? But again, management really, really matters here, because you can have it can be really low quality or it can be very high quality, depending on how well you manage that grazing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Mary, bringing out that quality factor, because over the production period of these annuals, they're going to have greater quality than the perennial grasses will have high quality at a point in time, but their quality is going to decrease more quickly than the quality of the annuals.
Very
Mary,
good.
I think you're up. I think Mary's up next, correct?
Well, I want to make a couple points on this before the next ones. We're going to compare it to our pasture rental rates, but all the superscripts that we have on here, keep in mind that he's got custom rates attributed in here, right? So when I had the corn and soybean budgets up there, we had a capital recovery for equipment on the assumption you were doing the work yourself with your equipment. So he does have that equipment piece in here in the form of custom rates, with, in theory, includes a little profit margin for the equipment and the operation of that stuff and the labor on it. So that would be included in here. And this is where it gets to that point of how you're actually going to incorporate these in your operation, right? So if incorporating annual forages into your operation allows you to reduce some of that equipment costs, or maybe even eliminate it if you moved completely away, that's a big decision versus just bringing it in a small scale type of thing. So keep that in mind as you look through these numbers and think about the actual trade-offs, because that's one that weighs into it. And I'll just mention, because I know Mary will have a slide on it later, talking about some of these, but we're looking at these as crops themselves. But of course, with some of these forages, you can double crop within the same year. So double up on some of these things in terms of potential net return. So anyway, Mary mentioned the pasture rates. If you're not familiar with a farm real estate market survey, we do have the preliminary numbers out for 2024. The official numbers will come out at the end of June. So there may be some slight tweaks to this, but this is probably pretty close to what they will look like. So as you move across the state, you see different numbers in terms of what's being charged for cow-calf pair monthly rates. Those are just regional supply-demand type of changes. Some of that could be reflected a little bit with the quality issues too. Some of that could be buried in there, as Mary mentioned, depending on where you're at in the state. But you see, we got a range for the Panhandle, anywhere from 51.20. You go up in the north part of the state, north central part of the state, and you're almost $74 per cow-calf pair. This would be for a 5-month grazing season. And of course, the pair, these AUMs and what's a pair, what's a per head charge, there's always some discussion on that. But if you go conservative and say that, a pair is 1.25 AUMs, meaning conservative is probably bigger than that. These would translate into about 64 to 92 or $93 an AUM type of charges. And you could also, another comparison, we've talked about this some too, if you were going to go feed hay, how does that compare? And again, this is very optimistic in that a ton of hay, would produce 2.5 AUMs of feed value. That's making bold assumptions that you waste almost nothing and it's good quality hay and so on. But yeah, you can see how that would translate going from $100 a ton up to 250, which those are ranges we've seen in the not too distant past. Of course, last year we were well up in that 200, 250 range. This year, maybe 150 to 200 and on down, depending on what quality you're looking for, but you can see how that translates into a per AUM charge of 40 to $100. So those are just some comparisons, feed value to think about in terms of incorporating the annual forages and what they might be worth to trade off with.
Well,
Oh, go ahead, Mary.
yeah, I gotta just say, I think there's a couple of things to think about when you're thinking about the forage value estimates. One is, as we mentioned, can you find pasture to rent in your area? And if not, maybe you can find it somewhere else. Then you also have to add that cost of, if I can find it some distance away from my location, how much is it going to cost me in terms of hauling the cattle, as well as me being able to go and check them, those types of things. So your situations are going to be different, and you're going to have to change these numbers to say, here's my opportunity cost, if that makes sense. And Jay mentioned the hay piece and the assumption of 2.5 AUMs per ton. Like you said, it is essentially assuming no waste. Depending on how you feed that, it's going to differ. If you're feeding a round bell feeder, it's 30%. You need to inflate those numbers by at least 30%, and it still doesn't account for the labor and the tractor costs and those stuff, what it takes to actually feed it. I did it just in my head, what the math is for $160 hay, and said I'm feeding it a round bell feeder, and it's now almost $80 an AUM. And that also does not include, that's kind of freight on board, right? That's not including transportation of the hay.
Yeah, I think you could easily argue 10 to 40%, maybe 40% on the extreme inflation on just about anything when you add in all those other costs, transportation, and so on. So, yep. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the rotations, Mary.
Yeah. So to be clear, we don't have enough time to talk about all the possibilities when it comes to annual forages. And we'll give you some resources if you're really interested in the production side, but we wanted to give some examples. And so this is one example. And I wanted to talk about it specifically because this is one we've been playing with lately. And the idea is kind of switching around a few things to use our perennial pasture a little bit differently than how we typically would. So we talked about rye and Sudan grass. And so this is my example. So I'd plant rye in the fall, like in September, October, even November. The later you plant it, the less early you can get on it, right? So I'm going to plant that, and then I'm going to start grazing it in the spring. Like early April is a good turnout time usually for us on cereal rye, and I can graze it for 2 months and then go ahead and terminate it and plant my warm season. So then I got to have a place for those cattle to go. And I'm going to take them to my smooth brome grass. In this case, this is my scenario here in June, while my Sudan grass is growing. And then I'm going to go back to that field of annuals, and I'm going to graze on Sudan grass for about 3 months. And that allows me to save my brome such that now in the fall, before, maybe I go to stocks, I can go back out onto brome and not have to feed hay. So now I'm filling a gap here where I don't have to feed hay for as long or as much. And so the question is now, instead of comparing my costs to what would be perennial pasture cost, maybe I've switched where I'm using my perennial pasture and I'm comparing it to hay. And so that's what the math was with the 160 at 30% waste. I said, okay, if I can get 5 AUMs off of my perennial pasture or off of my annuals, so my rye plus my Sudan grass, that's worth, on an AUM basis now, $390 total. Well, that looks pretty good. So that's $390 per acre. My cost, based off of what Daren said, was $199 an acre. And so if I put that together, I have $191 to pay for land cost. That actually doesn't look too bad. Again, like it's not making you a lot of money relative to what that rental cost is, but it's an option that seems like it's not out of the realm of possibilities, which I think is pretty interesting. One of the things that we're still trying to figure out here though is like, how many acres of brome do I need per cow in a situation like this, where now I'm using it differently, right? I'm not using it in early May. I am using it in a little bit in June and that month, and then I'm not using it until the fall again. So there's still some things we don't know 100% that we're playing around with, but this is what you need to think about. What's your scenario? What's my alternatives? And then you need to say what's different about them and what's similar about them. And so we did the same thing here now where we were looking at hay production. So maybe I'm not going to graze my annuals. Maybe I'm going to produce hay off of it. Is that an option? And is it a reasonable option? So what we assumed here is a range of yields, 1.5 to 3 tons per acre for oats, and for sorghum Sudan grass here, 3 to 5 tons an acre. Daren can tell you more about what the likely distribution is depending on your location, but I think it was useful just to come up with like, okay, if these are my costs and this is what I can get out of it, you know, how much does that cost me? And does it seem reasonable compared to the price of hay? So again, we took the forage costs that we had earlier. So for oats, it was $83 for, you know, the seed, the seeding, the fertilizer, those costs. And it was 119 for the sorghum Sudan grass. And then I put that on a cost per ton. So I took that range of yields and now said, okay, per ton of hay produced, how much would those things cost me? So that's what these ranges are, the 28 to 56 on the oats and the 24 to 40 on the sorghum Sudan. But if you're making hay, you got other costs, right? I got to make the hay. I got to cut the hay. I got to rake the hay, and I have to bale the hay. And so I put harvest costs in here, and this is using the custom rates from CAP. So, you know, again, you have to come up with your own costs, but this gives you some idea. And those ranges, because for mowing, I think the cost was something like $16 an acre. For raking, it was like $7 an acre. And then like $16 a bale for baling hay was kind of the cost we used. And so, of course, with baling hay, you have it on a cost per bale. So the more yield you get, the greater the cost per acre it is, if that makes sense to you. So that's what these numbers are. The 60 to 98 is assuming the mowing, the raking, and the baling costs. And so what I have here on total costs then is just adding those together. But you have to remember that the high cost on the forage production per ton and the low cost on the harvest costs per acre are actually together with the lower yields, if that makes sense. So it actually turns out that total cost per acre are really not tremendously different due to yield as I would have expected. We're 116 to 126 on oats. We're 140 to 170 on sorghum Sudan. But then if I put it on a cost per ton of hay basis, now I'm looking at 42 to 77 and 34 to $46 per ton. Those are pretty good, but again, I still got to think about what does it cost me for that land? If I own it, if I would potentially rent it out, or if I'm renting it from somebody. And so again, I just made an assumption. You'd have to plug in your own numbers, but $155 to $210 an acre adds another $19 to $47 a ton, depending on whether you're high yielding or low yielding, if that makes sense. But overall, $56 to $103 a ton, not looking too bad. What this has in it, though, or doesn't have in it, is two things that I think you need to think about. One is grazing versus haying. We paid for nitrogen fertilizer, but we didn't pay for any other fertilizer or export of nutrients. With hay, you're going to have that. With grazing, you're going to have less of that, right? And then the other one is there's risk to hay production, right? I mean, there's risk to grazing too, But there is risk that you get rained on, or you don't, you have something like a drought where you don't get as much productivity. And I think, Jay, you're going to talk a little bit about some risk management options here in a little while, which I think when you think about hay or grazing, I think it's worth considering, especially on dry land.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And I will get to that here in a moment on the risk management side. But as we wrap up, we use a lot of different tools when we talk to producers about this decision, and then as we put together numbers ourselves for presentations like this. So we thought we'd share some of those with you. And like I said, we'll put together a document that'll go out to people who registered for this webinar after the webinar, so you can capture these there. But one of them was we put Daren and Mary and I worked on this value of standing forage tool. So for some producers, they are looking at annual forages. Maybe they don't have the cattle, so they're looking at selling that annual forage. And if you don't have the haying equipment, it makes sense to think about selling it as a standing forage. So that was part of the motivation behind this tool. It is an Excel spreadsheet. It is available on our CAP website, and we have some documentation there to help you work through that. And we'd be happy to help you work through that too if you have any questions. So I wanted to point that out to you. And the other big thing is we've referenced the custom rates in Nebraska multiple times today. And of course, we put out a custom rates report every other year. So 2022 is our current report that's out, and we're collecting data now for a 2024 report. But that, of course, is also available on our CAP website with that / custom rates on the end. But you can find it on the main menu too there. So I wanted to point that out to folks too, that's available if you're not sure what it would cost to do some particular operation. That's where you can go find that information. And then Mary, you got some annual forage production resources too, including current set of webinars going on. So you want to talk about these?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just wanted people to recognize we realized we did not cover everything that there is to know about annual forages in this last 40 minutes here, and there's no way it was to be possible. So I wanted to point out a few resources that might be of use to you. Again, we'll send these out in an email, but the one that he just mentioned was we are having a cattle and coffee webinar series. It started April 23rd. It goes to May 16th. Our next one is actually on Tuesday, and we're going to talk about grazing the winter hardy spring small cereals and the management of that. So if you're interested in the production side and want to learn more, you should tune in to our webinar series. And I do have recordings of the past ones that are available as well. Also, we have a planting annuals forage guide, which really talks about, recommendations for seeding dates, rates, and depths. So when you have questions about, well, what should I plant when, that's a great go-to resource. In addition to this, the middle one here, which is a planning annual forage systems. The thing I like about this document is it starts helping you think about how you might piece things together. Again, there's a lot of combinations you can do. So it gets you started on that thought process, as well as how you might predict carrying capacity based off of expected productivity of the land. And if you don't know what your land might do, I will say that this is where your extension educators are a great resource. They can probably give you some ideas of, what things look like in your local area to help you come up with some estimates to then, be able to do some of these calculations to see, does this make sense for me or not? So those are just some of the resources that we have available. And of course, we're always open to be a good resource to get you along your way.
Thanks, Mary. And we'll close with I just want to take 2 or 3 minutes to mention this annual forage insurance program, because of course, you're talking about the trade-offs between row crops and annual forage. That's one of the big questions, because we have a very robust, well-established, subsidized crop insurance system for corn and soybeans. And people, ask the question, what is my equivalent of that on the annual forage side? Well, there is not annual forage production insurance per se, but there is a relatively new program by USDA terms called the Annual Forage Insurance Program, and it's a precipitation risk management program. So it's based off of the rainfall index, the same rainfall index that's used for pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance, PRF, if you've heard of that, which is a perennial equivalent of this insurance program. So I bring this up because a lot of people are not aware that this even exists, and and it is fairly complicated to use. So we don't have time to go into the nitty gritty details here today, but I will be doing a webinar in mid-June on this if you're interested in finding out more about it. That will go into some of those details and walk you through some different examples of how to use it. It is picking up steam, not near as much as pasture, rangeland, and forage, which we did some numbers the other day, and about half of our perennial grass acres are insured with PRF in the state at this point, which is about 3 times what it was before our drought hit this last time. So 3 to 4 times, maybe 5 times now I think about it if you go back prior to the drought starting. But I would argue PRF has become a way of doing business for those that are able to use it on their perennial grass. Long ways away from that on the annual forage side. But again, a lot of people are just flat not aware of it. But it does work off of those same 2-month rainfall index. The exact same data that's used for PRF is used for annual forage. So keep that in mind, that it does function the same in that regard. It is for annually planted crops, and the crops have to be intended for use for livestock feed. That's what makes you eligible to use it. Unlike PRF, which is available everywhere in the continental US, this is only available in 8 states, and Nebraska happens to be one of them. So it's right down the center of the country, starting in North Dakota, going down to Texas, and then picking up New Mexico and Colorado on our west flank. Sign up deadline for it is July 15th, and your coverage starts July 16th through the following July 15th. And when I say coverage starts, that's the planting dates that you can cover. So it is a little, you got to plan ahead on it, and it can be fairly complicated to wrap your head around all that stuff. But there is no cost for signing up for it. The cost only incurs when you actually report the acres. So you just got to plan ahead and say, I think I'm going to plant annual forages. I want to cover this type of rainfall that goes with that, and get that in place. And then when you actually plant the acres, if you want the insurance, you go in and report the actual acres that you want covered. It is on a monthly basis based off of when you plant. So think of it as you're going to cover 3 2-month intervals that follow. They can be consecutive, so 6 months, or you can delay it out a little bit and cover the last 6 months, or you can skip a month somewhere in the between. However it may work, but just because of the way these 2-month intervals work, there's up to 7 months that you can cover in there. So somewhere in there, you're not covering one of the months, but it's 3 2-month intervals that you cover after the planting month. But all of this needs to be selected by July 15th. And then, like I said, you plant and you have until the 5th of the next month to go in and report the acres. And that's when the insurance actually attaches. So I'll be doing a webinar on that in another month and a half or so, and we'll go through more details on that. And I welcome any questions that people may have on that. But want to make sure people are aware that there is an insurance option for annual forages. You just need to plan ahead and make it part of it. And it is subsidized, same level as PRF. So 51 to 59% of that premium is covered for you by the government. So it'll work very similar to PRF, but the dollar values are pretty high on that. You can cover $200 or $300 an acre in revenue out of that. So it's fairly lucrative to put it in place and get that coverage in place if you're interested in that. So let's see, I think we got time for a few questions if people have them. I'm not seeing any in the chat, but if anybody would have any questions for Daren, Mary, or myself, please feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself, and we'd be happy to entertain them live. I think we could do that, right, Ryan?
Yeah, if somebody really wants to talk on mic, we can have them raise their hands, and we can make that happen for sure.
Okay, so feel free to do that if you'd like. I know sometimes these questions can be pretty convoluted to try to type.
I will say one thing we didn't cover, we didn't talk about silage as an option. Of course, it is an option. And that was one of the things on the value standing forage that one of the big drivers was people having, for instance, rye, their neighbor has some rye and they're thinking, oh, I could make some silage off of that. They didn't know how to value it. And I do think that silage production is, of course, another option with these annuals that you could pencil in and think through. Double cropping annuals for silage might be something that's worth a look at.
Thanks, Mary. And do you guys, one of your morning ones was on silage, right? Was that or earlier this week?
Yeah, so Daren, actually the last two talks Daren did, he did one on warm seasons and silage production. And then this last one, which was this morning at 6:30 was on making small grain cereal silages.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I do think the silage is a pretty good way in particular to capture the value of the quality that these annuals have. While we would like to graze, I do think the grazing has you do have some utilization issues there with the grazing. So those are some other things. The big thing, the big difference, at least to me, from a decision point between the annuals we're talking about today and the perennials we're going to discuss next week. These annual forages, they can be an answer or a solution to a short-term window of use compared to the perennials, which what you'll find out next week is if you make that decision, they have a much longer window of use before they begin to return. So they're quite different. What's the added value that each one of them add to the system? We've kind of touched on that a bit. I think the annual forages are not a new thing. I think some of the new thing is we're starting to understand a little bit about them and how the need for them as a tool to help us integrate these livestock back into some of these croplands. That's one of the things Jay and Mary and I have worked with almost 10 years now. So.
Yep. Thanks, Daren. And as Daren mentioned, we'll be back next Thursday at the same time. He and I will take a look at that comparison of perennial forage to row crop. And as he said, that's a little bit more of a strategic decision because your payback period's a little bit longer on that one. And making it work is something that you definitely want to spend some time and get that set up correctly. Mary, you have.
Yeah, Jay Morgan just typed in the chat. She wanted you to go back to the website's slide, which I assume is the go back a slide or two where we had
that one.
Probably that would be.
Is that the one, Morgan? Okay. And we will be sending out. Yeah. Much variation in returns can be accounted for by grazing management. Yep, that's the right slide there. That's a good question.
That was from Ron Seelock. Ron always has good questions.
Yeah, I mean, so the question is, how much could I boost my performance with grazing management and my outputs versus how much could I reduce it, I guess would what I say. And I will say that there's a few things with annuals. One is that it seems like you got to get on them early to stimulate tillering, right? And if you get on them early enough and stimulate tillering, you get more productivity. Then the other part is trying not to let them to go reproductive, right? And so that they continue to grow and they keep the quality. And so, yes, you could do it poorly and probably not get the estimates that I used, which was a 2 and 3. I would not say that those were optimal management either. For instance, the 2 AUMs we got last year on rye was on dry land. And remember, we were dry last year. At the same time, the tap turned on in July. And so we did have for the Sudan grass, it was fairly wet. We got some trampling losses. I didn't get on it quite early enough. So, you know, I think they're probably reasonable estimates of something that is achievable. But could you go either way? Yeah, I think you could. Poor management, you'll get less, and better management, you'll get more. That would be my suggestion. Daren, you have other thoughts?
No, I mean, I think those are good suggestions. You know, Ron's been at this a while, and so he's going to be a little more. You got to be able to foresee the future a little bit in this as well. You know, so
I guess
you made the comment this morning, you know, about the maturity on the small grains, the winter annuals. You know that if you wait 2 or 3 days, you could be behind the 8 ball pretty quick. Same is going to go for these warm seasons as well, because they're going to go much quicker. So it's a challenge to try to balance the management with the outcome you're trying to achieve.
Well, his question, how much variation do you think, like on a given piece of land, poor versus great management, 20%, 30%, 40%? What do you think?
Probably twice. It's probably around 20, between 20-30% would be my guess.
Okay. I was just kind of curious. I think that's kind of what he was looking for, but.
Well, the first thing that popped into my mind on that was, well, that answer that question is similar to feeding hay in a hay ring.
Yeah.
So Daren, you thinking of that as a plus minus 20 or 30%, or a 20 to 30% range, top to bottom? See what I'm saying?
I do.
Plus or minus 10% off of is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. I'm guessing people can really mess this up. There are some outliers beyond that, but
yeah, it's you know, and it's. I mean, I think Mary and I spent a lot of time talking on the first couple of years that she was into this, and it was hard. There's a pretty steep learning curve on this, you know, and it's kind of understanding what it is. I think it's probably going to be 20%, but it's going to be skewed on the upper end.
Yeah. Well, maybe we ought to get a UNL trial going where we could have our students do this, right? Just give them some direction and see how good they do.
Well, you probably get some variability there. That actually is not a bad idea.
Good question, Ron. All right. Yeah, and one of them is just talking to people too, right? To take that, I mean, that's a whole part of the risk management stuff, is learning from other people's mistakes, so that hopefully you're at the top end of that productivity curve there. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. We thank you to the folks that typed in some questions, and we of course thank everybody for attending today. We will get a handout sent out to everybody who registered with these links in them for all these different resources that we pointed out to you. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our website, cap.unl.edu, if you'd like to revisit it. There's also spots up there to register for our upcoming webinars, including the one next week on perennial forage versus row crop, the same measuring up theme that we had here today. We'd also appreciate your feedback. As you exit the webinar, there'll be a very brief evaluation that we'd like to collect some information from you, including in most particular, some information on perhaps some upcoming webinars that you would like to see offered, whether they be the speakers in particular or the topics. We're always interested in any input that you have there, because we're here to help you. So I want to thank our speakers again, Mary and Daren. Thank you guys. Always a pleasure to work with you guys, and you're always full of great information, and really appreciate that. And thank everybody for joining us, and we'll go ahead and sign off, and everybody have a great afternoon.